San Francisco International Airport, September 1995. 9:15 on a Saturday morning. A 260-pound bodybuilder shoved his way through the check-in line, knocked a smaller man's bag off the scale, scattered his belongings across the terminal floor, and laughed. Then he called him a homeless bum who should learn not to stand in the way of real men. 40 people watched. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The smaller man knelt down on the linoleum and began picking up his clothes, slowly, deliberately, like a man who had already decided exactly what was going to happen next and was in no rush to get there. 5 seconds later, 260 pounds hit the floor, and the entire terminal went silent. The smaller man's name was Keanu Reeves, and not a single person in that airport knew it. He was 30 years old. His dark brown hair fell past his shoulders, slightly disheveled, the kind of hair that had not seen a professional stylist in months and did not care. He had thin, patchy stubble that was not quite a beard, more the consequence of not shaving than a deliberate choice. His face was lean and angular with slight hollows under the cheekbones, the face of a man who ate irregularly and slept less than he should. His eyes were warm and brown and carried something behind them that people who had experienced significant loss would recognize immediately but could not name. He wore a faded black leather jacket with a scratched zipper over a wrinkled white t-shirt. His jeans were dark and worn with a small hole at the left knee. His boots were black and scuffed at the toes and heels from years of daily use. No watch, no jewelry, no designer labels. Nothing on his body suggested wealth or fame or anything other than a young man who traveled light and did not spend money on appearances. He carried a black duffel bag, old and fraying at the shoulder strap. Inside were 3 days of clothing and a film script held together with a rubber band. The script was for an action role, a small part in an independent film that paid almost nothing but required the kind of physical work that Keanu wanted to prove he could do without a stunt double. He had been reading it on the flight from New York, making notes in pencil along the margins. Fight choreography ideas, angles of attack, the precise mechanics of how a body moves when it means to do harm versus when it is merely performing harm for a camera. Those notes were the product of 3 years of daily training. Not gym training, not the kind of training that builds muscles people can see, the kind that builds reflexes people cannot see until it's too late. After his best friend River Phoenix died 2 years earlier, collapsing outside the Viper Room on Sunset Boulevard, while Keanu stood right there, close enough to touch him, close enough to feel the warmth leaving his body, Keanu had needed something physical to keep himself from coming apart. Grief had a weight to it, actual physical weight. It sat on his chest at 3 in the morning and pressed down until breathing became an act of will rather than instinct. He needed something that demanded his complete attention, something that left no room for the image of River's face going slack on the sidewalk while the ambulance sirens grew louder and simultaneously became meaningless. He found judo, a small dojo in Red Hook, Brooklyn, run by an old instructor named Park who never watched television and had no idea who Keanu was and did not care. Park taught 3 things: how to fall without breaking, how to use an opponent's force against them, how to stop the moment the threat ended, because everything after that point was no longer defense, but something darker. 3 years, 4 sessions a week, sometimes 5. Keanu learned to redirect force instead of meeting it. He learned that a 175-pound body, when its weight was properly distributed and its center of gravity was precisely controlled, could become immovable to someone much larger who did not understand the physics of what they were pushing against. He learned Osotogari, the major outer reap, a technique so fundamental it was taught in the first month and so devastating it remained effective at the highest levels of competition. He learned that real strength was not about size. It was about timing, and timing was something Keanu Reeves had been studying his entire life. The timing of when to speak and when to stay silent. The timing of when to move and when to stand still. The timing of a body falling on a sidewalk and the timing of sirens that arrived too late. He understood timing the way a musician understands rhythm, not as something calculated, but as something felt, something that lived in the space between thought and action. On this Saturday morning in September 1995, he was third in line at the United Airlines check-in counter, his duffel bag between his boots, his sunglasses partially concealing his face. He was flying to Los Angeles for the casting. The role was small. The pay was smaller. But the fight sequences in the script were exactly the kind of work he wanted to build his career on, and he was willing to accept minimum wage to prove he could do them himself. A few people in the queue had murmured something about recognizing him. The whispers moved down the line like a small wave and dissolved without becoming anything larger. Speed had come out the year before, and his face had been on some magazine covers, but Keanu in real life looked nothing like the actor on the poster. The poster showed a clean-shaven man with styled hair and the kind of jaw that cinematographers lit carefully. The man in the check-in line looked like he might be sleeping in his car and had not eaten a proper meal since Tuesday. Nobody was sure. Nobody asked. Keanu did not notice the whispers because he was thinking about River. He was always thinking about River. 2 years, and the grief had not diminished. It had simply changed shape. In the first months, it was a knife. Sharp and specific, and located in a single point behind his sternum. Now it was more like weather. A permanent overcast that colored everything without preventing function. He could work. He could train. He could stand in a check-in line on a Saturday morning and wait his turn with the patience of a man who had learned that most of life was waiting, and the important thing was what you did with your hands while you waited. His hands were in his jacket pockets. His weight was centered. His breathing was even. He was simply a young man waiting to check a bag. Tyler Brandt arrived at 9:22. He was 26 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, and weighed 260 pounds. An amateur heavyweight bodybuilder out of San Jose who had spent 6 years in obsessive ironwork that had built a 52-inch chest and arms measuring 21 inches that strained the sleeves of the tight white tank top he wore despite the September morning chill. Because the arms were the point. The arms were always the point with men like Tyler. He had a face that had grown accustomed to the particular deference that very large men receive in public spaces. The small, unconscious adjustments other people make when serious mass is moving in their direction. Shoulders turning, body shifting, eyes dropping. The instinctive biological response of smaller organisms making room for larger ones. Tyler had spent 6 years mistaking this deference for respect. It was not respect. It was physics. The simple calculation that soft tissue performs automatically when confronted with something hard and heavy and moving with intent. Tyler did not know the difference between fear and admiration because from where he stood, the result looked identical. People moved out of his way. People did not challenge him. People adjusted their behavior in his presence. He called that respect because he did not have a word for what it actually was. What it actually was absence. The absence of confrontation. The absence of resistance. The absence of anyone willing to stand in his path and say no. And Tyler had confused this absence with something he had earned rather than something he had merely imposed. His companion was Jake Dawson, 27, similarly built but slightly smaller, wearing a black tank top, walking half a step behind Tyler with the specific body language of a man whose primary social function was to serve as audience and validation for someone else's performance. Jake laughed when Tyler made jokes. Jake agreed when Tyler made proclamations. Jake existed, in the context of their friendship, as a mirror that always reflected Tyler as larger than he was. They were running late for their flight. Tyler began moving along the length of the check-in, cue the way a large ship moves through a narrow channel, using displacement rather than invitation. He shouldered past the first person in line, a businessman in a gray suit carrying a leather briefcase, who stepped aside without protest and said nothing because the calculation his body performed concluded that protesting was not worth the energy expenditure. He shouldered past the second, an older woman with silver hair who pulled her carry-on bag to her chest and pressed herself against the rope guide and looked at the floor. She said nothing. Nobody nearby said anything on her behalf. The third person behind the businessman was Sophie Callahan. She was 25 years old, a medical student with brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, brown eyes, a gray sweater under a denim jacket, a backpack over one shoulder. She had been standing directly behind Keanu in the line for 8 minutes, close enough to notice that the man in front of her smelled like leather and airport coffee and something faintly like the training mats at her university gym. 2 months earlier, Sophie had left a relationship that had consumed 3 years of her life and most of her sense of self. His name does not matter. What matters is that he was large and loud and had a specific way of moving into her space that made her body go rigid and her mind go blank, a survival response that her nervous system had learned to execute automatically because the alternative, resistance, had historically produced worse outcomes. When Tyler Brandt moved toward her in the line, his mass displacing air, his shoulder leading, his entitled confidence radiating outward like heat from an engine, Sophie's body performed the same calculation it had been performing for 3 years. It shut down. Her hands went still. Her eyes went unfocused. Her breathing became shallow and mechanical. She did not step aside because stepping aside required motor function, and motor function required a connection between brain and body that had just been severed by a memory that was louder than the present moment. She froze. Tyler did not notice her. He had already moved past, his attention on the next obstacle, which was the back of a faded black leather jacket belonging to a thin man with long dark hair who was standing very still and looking toward the counter. Tyler applied the same pressure, the same lateral push with the shoulder, the same wordless assumption that the smaller body would yield because that was how the physics of public spaces worked. Keanu did not move. He shifted his weight slightly, perhaps 2 or 3 degrees of rotation in his torso, and the push found no purchase. No levity. No compliance. It was like pushing against a tree, not because the tree was heavy, but because it was rooted. 3 years of judo had taught Keanu how to distribute his weight through his legs into the floor in a way that made his 175 pounds feel like something anchored to the earth itself. They were scattered across a 6-foot radius. Keanu picked up each page individually, checking the page numbers, placing them in order. His pencil notes were visible on each margin. Technical descriptions of fight choreography, angles, footwear patterns, the precise mechanics of osotogari written in English with Japanese terms transliterated phonetically beside them. He paused on one page, a scene description he had rewritten 3 times. In the margin, in his small, careful handwriting, he had written something that was not about choreography. It was about river. A single sentence he had put down during a late-night flight when the grief had needed somewhere to go. He looked at the sentence for a moment. Then he placed the page with the others, gently, and continued collecting. Tyler's laughter continued for a while. Then it began to thin at the edges as the silence from Keanu stretched longer than expected. Laughter required a reaction to sustain itself. Laughter was a social mechanism that needed either an audience response or a victim response to maintain its energy. Keanu was providing neither. He was simply kneeling on the floor, folding clothes, sorting pages, existing in a state of such complete composure that the laughter had nothing to attach to and began to die of natural causes. Tyler filled the silence with another comment. Something to Jake about how some people did not understand that the world had a natural order and natural orders placed certain people above certain other people. The words had less conviction than the first ones. They were filler. Maintenance noise generated to cover the growing discomfort of a man who was beginning to sense that the script he was following and the script Keanu was following were not the same script, and that the other man's script might have a different ending. Keanu finished repacking his bag. He placed the script on top, pages ordered, edges aligned. He closed the zipper with a clean, decisive sound that carried in the quiet the way a gavel carries in a courtroom. A sound that meant something was ending and something else was about to begin. He stood up. He turned and faced Tyler Brandt directly with the complete, unhurried attention of someone who had finished everything they needed to finish and now had time for this. Full attention. The kind of attention that most people never experience because most people divide their awareness across a dozen inputs simultaneously. Keanu did not divide. He focused. And when 100% of his attention landed on Tyler, the bodybuilder felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. The 40 people in the surrounding area who had been watching this unfold went completely quiet. Rebecca Torres stopped typing. The ambient noise of the terminal seemed to pull back slightly, the way sound behaves in a large space when something is about to happen that demands attention. Keanu spoke, clearly, without performance, projecting his voice not through volume, but through precision. Each word landing exactly where it was aimed. You're going to apologize, or I am going to demonstrate why size without discipline is just dead weight. He said it the way a physician states a diagnosis, not as a threat, as an assessment of the available facts. A clinical observation about the probable outcome of a situation that the patient was free to alter through a simple change of behavior. Apologize and the situation resolves. Do not apologize and the demonstration proceeds. The choice was Tyler's. The outcome of both choices was already determined. Tyler stared at him. He ran the calculation again. 175 pounds. 6 feet 1. Arms that were lean and functional but would not turn a head in any gym. Thin stubble. Long messy hair. Worn out boots. A man who looked like he might be carrying everything he owned in that duffel bag. Tyler had done this calculation before. It had always produced the same answer. The answer had always been correct. There was no reason, no physical reason that he could identify why this situation should be any different. He decided the situation was not different. He smiled at Jake. Then he took one step forward and extended his right hand toward Keanu's chest. Open-palmed, the dominant push that establishes hierarchy without technically crossing into assault. The move that had ended a dozen confrontations in his favor without ever requiring him to actually fight anyone, because nobody had ever stood there long enough to make a fight necessary. The hand never reached Keanu's chest. What happened in the next 5 seconds was this. In the first second, Keanu's left hand intercepted the incoming push at the wrist. He did not block it with force. He redirected it. His fingers wrapped around Tyler's wrist and guided it outward in a circular motion so smooth and economical that several witnesses later described it as looking like the bodybuilder's own arm had simply changed its mind about where it was going. This was Tai Sabaki, body management, the fundamental principle of judo that Park had drilled into Keanu 4 sessions a week for 3 years until it lived in his nervous system the way breathing lived there, automatic and below the threshold of conscious thought. In the second, Keanu stepped deep into Tyler's space using tsugi-ashi, the sliding step that closes distance without telegraphing intention. He was now inside Tyler's reach, in the range where 260 pounds of gym muscle became a liability rather than an asset, because gym training did not teach close-range combat. Gym training taught isolated movements. Bench press, curl, squat. None of those movements functioned in the 12 inches of space between two bodies where judo operated. Keanu's right hand gripped the fabric of Tyler's tank top at the chest. His right foot hooked deep behind Tyler's right leg, the support leg, the one carrying the majority of Tyler's weight because the redirection of his arm had shifted his center of gravity onto that single point. In the third second, Keanu's hips rotated. This was the engine of Osoto Gari. Not the arms, not the shoulders, the hips. The same kinetic chain that generated power in a golf swing or a baseball pitch. The sequential activation of legs and core and torso that channeled momentum through the body and into the contact point with devastating efficiency. Keanu's 175 pounds, when focused through that chain, exceeded anything that 260 pounds of untrained mass could produce in a comparable movement. His legs swept, his hands pulled, his hips drove, and 260 pounds of Tyler Brandt, which had been balanced on a single support leg that was no longer there, experienced the fundamental truth of physics that Park had taught on the first day. Remove the only remaining support at the moment when the center of gravity is displaced, and the result is not a fall. It is a collapse. Total. Immediate. Inevitable. The muscle is irrelevant. The size is irrelevant. Gravity does not negotiate. In the fourth second, 260 pounds of Bodybuilder met the linoleum floor of San Francisco International Airport with an impact that traveled through the terminal like a minor geological event. The sound was enormous. It reverberated in the bones of every person standing within 20 feet. Tyler landed on his back, arms and legs extended without control, the air driven from his lungs by the force of impact against a surface that had no give, no cushion, no mercy. His mouth opened. No sound came out because no air was moving in either direction. His hands went instinctively to his midsection, the ancient reflex of a body trying to protect the site of injury after the injury has already occurred. In the fifth second, Keanu Reeves stood over Tyler Brandt for exactly one heartbeat. One single beat of his heart. Long enough for Tyler, staring up from the floor through eyes that were watering from shock, to see the face looking down at him. Calm, composed, brown eyes that held no anger, no triumph, no satisfaction. Just the same clinical assessment that had been there before the technique, the face of a man who had done what needed doing and was now confirming that it was done. Then Keanu stepped back. He did not follow Tyler to the ground. He did not apply a joint lock. He did not strike him while he was down. He did not say anything. He did not stand over him to savor the moment or to make sure 40 witnesses understood who had won. He simply stepped back because the threat had ended, and continuing past the end of the threat was something else entirely, and that something else was a room Keanu refused to enter. He turned back to the counter. Rebecca Torres was standing with both hands flat on the surface, an expression on her face that suggested her training manual did not contain a chapter on what she had just witnessed. "Excuse the interruption," Keanu said, placing his duffel bag back on the scale. "My bag is within the weight limit." Rebecca looked at the scale. The number settled. 42 pounds, she said, in a voice that was operating on automatic pilot, while her conscious mind processed the previous 5 seconds. Well within the limit. She printed the boarding pass. Her hands were not entirely steady, but she managed it. Keanu took the pass, thanked her with genuine warmth, and walked toward the seating area with the unhurried calm of a man who had completed his check-in procedure and had some time before boarding. Behind him, Tyler Brandt was beginning the slow process of recovering the ability to breathe. It took almost 2 full minutes before his diaphragm stopped spasming and allowed air to move in both directions. He lay on his back, staring at the fluorescent lights above him, conscious the entire time, completely unable to do anything about his situation, which was the floor and the inability to breathe and the 40 people looking down at him. Jake had crouched beside him, asking questions that Tyler could not answer because answering required air, and air was still arriving in shallow, painful increments. When Tyler finally managed to sit up, assisted by Jake's arm under his shoulder, he looked around the terminal for Keanu, not with the intention of continuing anything, with the expression of a man who has just had a fundamental assumption about the world corrected in the most direct way available and is still in the early stages of processing the correction. He had believed for 6 years that 260 pounds of muscle was a reliable source of dominance in physical confrontations. That belief was now on the floor beside him, broken in exactly the way his body had been broken, thoroughly and without ceremony. What replaced it was not yet clear. That would take longer. But the absence of the old belief was already complete. 3 people approached Keanu in the waiting area before boarding began. The first was Frank Morrison, 45 years old, wearing a gray suit, hair going silver at the temples. He had been a martial arts instructor for 15 years, teaching karate and self-defense at a studio in San Jose, and he approached Keanu with the specific deference of a professional encountering someone operating at a level above his own. "Excuse me," he said, extending his hand. "Frank Morrison. I teach self-defense in San Jose." I have been teaching for 15 years, and I have never seen a more perfect demonstration of economy of movement. The Tai Sabaki was instantaneous, and the timing of the Osoto Gari was precise beyond anything I could explain to my students without showing them that exact sequence. He paused, genuine curiosity overriding professional etiquette. Would you be willing to tell me what system that was? Keanu looked at him for a moment, then shook his hand. His response carried the genuine thoughtfulness of someone who had been considering these questions seriously for 3 years and had arrived at answers that mattered to him. It was not a specific system, Keanu said. It was the application of principles. Intercept the attack during preparation, before it has generated momentum. Step inside the range, where size becomes a disadvantage. Use the opponent's committed weight against him with the sweep. Those principles work regardless of the system you practice. He paused. The system is the vehicle. The principles are what actually function. Frank nodded slowly, producing a small notebook from his jacket pocket and writing something in it. Keanu watched him write with an expression of quiet satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who had learned something difficult through years of work and was pleased to find that the knowledge could transfer to someone who was genuinely listening. One more question, Frank said. The stop. You stopped cleanly the moment he was down. No follow-up. No continuation. That is the hardest part to teach. Because it is the most important part, Keanu replied. The goal in a real confrontation is never to destroy the opponent. The goal is to end the threat. The moment the threat ends, continuing is no longer defense. It becomes something else. And that something else creates problems, legal and moral, that the original defense did not create. The discipline of stopping is as important as the skill of acting. Frank wrote that down too. He thanked Keanu and returned to his seat. Keanu watched him go, then returned to looking out the window at the tarmac where planes were taxiing in the morning light. The second person was Sophie Callahan. She approached slowly from the side, the way a person approaches when they're not entirely sure their legs will carry them the full distance. Her face was pale. Her hands were trembling slightly, a residual vibration from the adrenaline dump that her body was still processing. She stood beside Keanu's row of seats and spoke in a voice that was trying very hard to be steady and not quite managing it. I needed to see that, she said. That man was intimidating everyone in that line. The way he pushed past people. His comments. His whole attitude. He was treating every person in that queue like they were obstacles. I was preparing myself for when he reached me, because I knew he was going to push me too. She stopped. Her breathing hitched. But when he got to me, I could not move. I just froze. I stood there like a statue while he went right past me, and I could not make my body do anything. I have been hating myself for the last 10 minutes because of it. Her eyes were bright with tears she was fighting to hold back. Not tears of sadness. Tears of the specific frustration that comes from a body that will not obey commands during the moments when obedience matters most. Keanu looked at her for a long moment. His expression changed. Not dramatically. A softening around the eyes. A slight inclination of his head. The look of someone who has just recognized something in another person that they carry themselves. Can I tell you something? He said. She nodded. 2 years ago, my best friend died. Right in front of me. On a sidewalk in Los Angeles. I was standing close enough to touch him. Close enough to feel it happening. And I did not do anything. I stood there while he died because my body would not move. Everything locked up. My hands. My legs. My breathing. I watched him go, and I could not take a single step. Sophie stared at him. Her tears spilled over, running down both cheeks. For months afterward, I hated myself for not acting, for freezing, for being right there and being completely useless. But then I started training, and my instructor told me something that I did not believe at first but have come to understand is true. He leaned forward slightly. Freezing is not weakness. It is what happens when the body encounters something larger than its current ability to process. It is a protection mechanism. It shuts you down to keep you from doing something that your nervous system has learned through experience will make things worse. Your body was not failing you in that line. Your body was trying to keep you safe based on what it learned from whoever taught it, that freezing was the best option. Sophie's hand went to her mouth. She understood what he was saying. He was not talking about an airport. He was talking about everything that had happened before the airport. Do not hate your body for protecting you, Keanu said quietly. It did what it knew how to do. The next step is teaching it something new. That takes time, and it takes patience with yourself. But it starts with not punishing yourself for surviving the way you survived. Sophie could not speak. She nodded. She reached out and squeezed his hand briefly, then walked away quickly, her shoulders shaking. Keanu watched her go and thought about River, about the sidewalk, about the sound of the ambulance that arrived too late to matter. He understood her. He understood her completely. The third person was Walter Bennett, 68 years old, silver hair, a worn jacket with a military unit patch on the shoulder. He walked with a slight limp and a cane that he used more for habit than necessity. His face had the specific texture of a man who had seen enough of human capacity for violence to have formed real opinions about it. "Son," he said, and the word came without condescension. It was simply the word he used for men younger than himself who had earned his attention. "I saw combat in Vietnam. All kinds. Rifles, knives, things I will not describe in an airport. What you did just now was textbook effective. Minimum force required. Maximum effect. Clean termination of threat without escalation beyond the point of necessity." He paused, looking at Keanu with the direct assessment of someone who evaluated these things professionally, even decades after the profession ended. "You stopped when the threat was neutralized. You did not continue. That kind of discipline is rarer than the technique. Most men who can fight keep fighting past the point of necessity because the adrenaline demands it. You stopped on a dime. That takes something the body does not want to give." Keanu received this with the seriousness it deserved. "The goal in real confrontation is never to destroy the opponent," he said. "It is to end the threat. The moment the threat ends, continuing becomes something else. And that something else creates damage that the original defense did not create. Damage to the other person. Damage to yourself. The kind of damage that follows you home and sits in the chair across from you at dinner and does not leave." Walter nodded, recognizing the words of someone who had thought about this deeply and personally, not just technically. "What will you do now?" the old man asked. "Take my flight," Keanu said. "I have somewhere I need to be." Walter smiled slightly, the smile of a man who appreciated simplicity. He shook Keanu's hand and walked away, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the terminal floor. 15 minutes before boarding, 2 airport security officers approached Keanu in the waiting area. The senior officer, a man in his 40s with the expression of someone who had genuinely seen everything in 2 decades of airport work, identified himself and explained that they had received a report of a physical altercation in the check-in area. Keanu provided an account without embellishment or omission. The same level tone he used for everything. The attempted push, the destruction of his bag, the racial comment about a homeless person not belonging in the way of real men, the second attempted push, and his response. The officers spoke with 6 witnesses. They returned after 10 minutes. "Every witness confirms your account," the senior officer said. His expression had shifted towards something that could be described as professional respect. "Multiple people described the other individual as the clear aggressor and confirmed that you made verbal attempts at resolution before any physical contact occurred. You are technically within your rights to file assault charges." Keanu considered this, genuinely, not as performance. "No," he said finally. "I want to take my flight. If he learned something today, that is sufficient." The point of the situation was the lesson, not the punishment. The officers studied him for a moment. That is a generous perspective. It is the only one that lets everyone move forward. Tyler did not file charges either. Jake explained to the security officers, in a tone that carried the specific embarrassment of someone managing a situation they wanted to end quickly, that his friend had decided not to pursue the matter. The real reason, which Jake did not state, but which the security officers understood from context, was that Tyler could not construct any version of the story that did not require explaining how 260 pounds of competitive bodybuilder had ended up on the floor after attempting to push a man who weighed 85 pounds less. Any version of that story told in any official capacity would follow him forever. So he said nothing. He and Jake would take a later flight. But Keanu did not take his flight either. Not yet. He was sitting in the waiting area, boarding pass in hand, duffel bag between his boots, when he looked through the glass partition toward the check-in area and saw something that changed his mind about leaving. Tyler Brandt was still sitting on the floor, not where he had fallen. He had moved to the wall near the entrance to the jetway, his back against the concrete, his knees drawn up, his massive arms wrapped around them. Jake was gone. Jake had left the moment the security officers arrived, disappearing into the terminal crowd with the speed and decisiveness of a man whose primary instinct was self-preservation and whose loyalty to Tyler extended exactly as far as the absence of personal consequence. Tyler was alone, and from 40 feet away, through the glass, Keanu could see something that the 40 witnesses had not seen, something that required a specific kind of experience to recognize. Tyler was not sitting on the floor because he was injured. He was sitting on the floor because he was broken, not physically. The technique had been clean. Nothing was torn or fractured. The breaking was deeper than that. For 6 years, Tyler Brandt had built his body as a fortress. 260 pounds of armor constructed brick by brick, rep by rep, set by set, against a specific threat that he had never told anyone about. His father, a former college football player who had beaten Tyler from the time he was old enough to disappoint until the time he was large enough to frighten. 6 years of iron was not about competition or aesthetics or the admiration of strangers. It was about making sure that no one could ever put him on the ground again. And someone just had. Someone who weighed 175 pounds and wore a torn leather jacket and looked like he lived in his car. The fortress had failed. The armor was useless. And the thing the armor had been built to protect, the frightened boy who still lived somewhere inside 260 pounds of muscle, was now exposed, sitting on an airport floor with no walls left. Keanu recognized this because he carried his own version of it. Not armor built from muscle. Armor built from silence, from isolation, from the decision to stop caring about things that could be taken away. After River died, Keanu had constructed his own fortress, just as carefully and just as desperately as Tyler had constructed his. Keanu's fortress was invisibility. If nobody knew who he was, nobody could take anyone else from him because there would be no one to take. He recognized Tyler's collapse because he had experienced his own, not on a public floor, in a private apartment at 3 in the morning, sitting against a wall in the dark, understanding with terrible clarity that the thing he had built to protect himself was actually the thing preventing him from healing. Keanu stood up. He walked to a vending machine and bought 2 cups of coffee. Black, the bad kind that airports sold. The kind that tasted like fuel and disappointment, but was warm, and that was enough. He walked back through the check-in area, past the counter where Rebecca Torres watched him with wide eyes, past the spot on the linoleum where the technique had occurred, to the wall where Tyler Brandt sat with his arms around his knees, his face hidden, his shoulders rigid with the effort of not coming apart. Keanu sat down beside him, right there on the cold floor, with his back against the same wall, his legs stretched out in front of him. He set 1 cup of coffee on the floor between them and held the other in both hands. Tyler's head came up. His eyes were red. His face was a mask of fear and humiliation and the specific confusion of a man whose entire operating system had just crashed and had not yet begun to reboot. When he saw Keanu, he flinched. Actually flinched, the way a person flinches when the thing that hurt them appears again. He pressed himself harder against the wall. "I do not want trouble," he said. His voice was raw, stripped. The voice of a 26-year-old rather than the performance of a man who wanted to sound 35 and dangerous. "It is done. We are done." Keanu did not look at him directly. He looked at the coffee in his hands. He spoke quietly. "I did not come to fight. I came because you look like someone who needs coffee." Tyler stared at him. The sentence did not compute. The man who had put him on the floor 5 minutes ago was now sitting beside him on the same floor, offering him a hot beverage. This did not fit any model of the world that Tyler had ever constructed. They sat in silence for a long time. Airport noise filled the space around them. Boarding announcements, the rumble of luggage wheels, the distant roar of engines, all of it passing over them, like weather passing over a landscape, touching everything but changing nothing about the two men sitting on the floor against the wall. Tyler broke first. His voice came out thick and unsteady, the voice of someone speaking words that had been locked inside a fortress for a very long time and were only now finding the exit. My old man used to beat me. Every day, from the time I was 6 until I was 16 and big enough to scare him into stopping. I started lifting this summer I turned 15. Every pound I gained was a pound between me and him. I told myself that if I got big enough, nobody could ever put me on the ground again. He swallowed hard. 6 years. Every single day, building the one thing that was supposed to keep me safe. And you put me down in 5 seconds like I was nothing. Like 6 years of work meant nothing. Keanu held his coffee. He listened the way Park had taught him to listen in the dojo, with his whole body, without preparing a response while the other person was still speaking, without interrupting, without judgment, just receiving. When Tyler was finished, the silence came back. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not hostile, not empty, full of everything that had been said and everything that still waited. I lost my best friend 2 years ago, Keanu said. He was not looking at Tyler. He was looking at the far wall of the terminal, at a departure board cycling through flight numbers and gate assignments. His name was River. He died on a sidewalk in Los Angeles while I stood right there, close enough to catch him. I did not catch him. I froze. The same way I saw a woman freeze in that line today when you walked past her. Tyler's breathing changed. After River died, I wanted to disappear. I wanted to build walls so high that nothing could reach me again. No people, no relationships, no connections that could be severed. I started training martial arts not because I wanted to hurt anyone. I started because I needed something physical to keep my mind from destroying itself at 3 in the morning. He took a sip of coffee. It was terrible. He drank it anyway. The training taught me something your gym never taught you. It taught me that real strength is not about making other people smaller. It is about knowing exactly what you are capable of and choosing not to use it unless there is no other option. You spent 6 years building armor. I understand why. I understand the thing you were building it against. But armor does not protect you, Tyler. Armor isolates you. And if nobody can reach you, nobody can help you. And if nobody can help you, you stay exactly where you are, which is on the floor of an airport, alone, wondering why 6 years of work collapsed in 5 seconds. Tyler's jaw clenched. His eyes were bright. He was fighting the thing that was rising inside him, the flood behind the dam, the boy behind the fortress. Then what am I supposed to do? His voice cracked on the last word. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the script, the pages he had carefully collected and reordered from the linoleum floor. He tore a corner from the last page, the blank part below the final scene description, and produced a pencil stub from his other pocket. He wrote an address, a name, a dojo in Red Hook, Brooklyn. The man who runs this place is named Park. He will not ask you who you are. He will not care how much you bench press. He will teach you how to use your body as a tool instead of a weapon. He will teach you that real strength comes from the ability to stop, not the ability to start. He placed the torn paper on the floor beside the coffee cup. You do not owe me anything. What happened between us is done. But if you want to understand the difference between muscle that performs and muscle that functions, between the body as display and the body as instrument, that address is where I learned it. That is where I am still learning it. Tyler looked at the paper. He looked at the coffee. He looked at Keanu, sitting beside him on the cold floor, a thin man in a worn leather jacket who had taken him apart in 5 seconds and then come back to put something together. Why would you do this? Tyler whispered. I called you a homeless bum. I kicked your bag across the floor. I humiliated you in front of 40 people. Yes, Keanu said. And you are sitting here giving me the address of your gym. I'm sitting here giving you a door. You can walk through it or you can ignore it. That part is up to you. But the door exists because someone gave me a door when I needed one. After River, after the worst night of my life, someone told me there was a place where I could learn to fall without breaking. I walked through that door. It saved my life. He stood up. His knees reminded him that floors were not designed for sitting. He picked up his duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder. The coffee is for you. It is terrible. Drink it anyway. Sometimes terrible coffee is better than no coffee. He turned and started walking toward the gate. His boots made their soft, worn sound on the linoleum. His hair moved slightly as he passed beneath an air vent. He looked like a man who had completed everything he needed to complete at this airport and was now proceeding to his next destination. Tyler watched him go. He sat on the floor for another 10 minutes, holding the torn paper in one hand and the coffee in the other, staring at the handwriting of a stranger who had given him the two most important things he had ever received: a lesson in 5 seconds and a door written on the corner of a film script that he could walk through whenever he was ready. Keanu made his flight. He settled into the window seat and placed the duffel bag under the seat in front of him. He pulled out the script, now slightly wrinkled from its adventure on the linoleum, and opened it to the scene he had been annotating before the interruption. A fight sequence. 2 characters. The smaller one wins through technique and timing rather than size. He had written detailed notes in the margins about body mechanics and camera angles. But now he picked up his pencil and added a new line at the bottom of the page. Real power is knowing when to stop. He looked out the window. The plane was taxiing past the terminal. Somewhere in that building, a 26-year-old man was sitting on the floor, deciding what to do with a torn piece of paper. And somewhere in Los Angeles, a casting director was waiting to see whether this unknown actor could fight convincingly enough to build a career on it. He thought about River, about the sidewalk, about the weight of grief, and the discovery that grief could be channeled into something useful if you found the right vessel. Judo had been his vessel. The scripts were his vessel. The training was his vessel. Every morning on the mats at Park's dojo, falling and rising and falling again, and learning that falling was not failure. It was preparation for the next time you stood up. The plane lifted off. San Francisco fell away below him, becoming a map of itself, then a patchwork of color, then a coastline, then clouds. Tyler Brandt did not take a flight that day. He sat in the airport for 3 more hours after Keanu left, watching planes depart, holding the torn paper, drinking the terrible coffee until it was cold. When the coffee was gone, he held the empty cup for another hour because it was the first thing anyone had given him, freely and without expectation, since he was 15 years old and his mother had pressed a $20 bill in his hand and told him to buy groceries because his father had spent the household money on beer again. He went home to San Jose. He did not call the number on the paper. Not that week. Not the week after. He placed the torn page in the drawer of his nightstand and felt its presence there the way you feel a light source you cannot see, a warmth at the edge of awareness that you know is there because the darkness around is slightly less dark. 3 weeks later, at 2 in the morning, after a nightmare about his father that left him sitting up in bed with his heart pounding and his fists clenched around sheets that he had nearly torn in half, Tyler opened the drawer. He looked at the address. He looked at the name. Park, Red Hook, Brooklyn. He bought a plane ticket the next morning. The flight from San Jose to New York was 5 hours and 23 minutes. Tyler spent every minute of it staring out the window at clouds he had never really looked at before. He had flown dozens of times. He had never once noticed clouds. The world outside the fortress had always been irrelevant because the fortress was the only thing that mattered. But the fortress was gone, and without it, everything outside became suddenly, overwhelmingly visible. The clouds, the way sunlight moved across their surfaces. The tiny shadow of the plane sliding over the landscape below like a dark fish moving through a pale ocean. He watched it all with the raw, unprotected eyes of someone seeing the world for the first time after years of looking at nothing but their own reflection. He landed at JFK. He took a taxi to Brooklyn. The driver asked him if he was a football player. Tyler said no. The driver asked if he was a wrestler. Tyler said no again. The driver looked at him in the rearview mirror at the 260 pounds folded into the back seat and said, "Well, brother, whatever you are, I hope it's something good." Tyler did not have an answer for that. Park's dojo was above a laundromat, up a narrow flight of stairs that smelled of detergent and old wood. The mats were clean but worn. The space was small. There were no mirrors, which confused Tyler because every gym he had ever been in had mirrors, and the absence of his own reflection made him feel unmoored. Park was old. His hands were calloused, and his back was slightly bent, and his eyes were the eyes of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything human beings did approximately 4 decades ago. He looked at Tyler, at the 260 pounds, at the arms, at the chest, at the specific way Tyler held his body, tense and defensive and ready for the evaluation that always came from strangers assessing his size. Park said one thing: "Take off your shoes." That was it. No evaluation, no measurement, no comparison. Just the instruction to remove the thing that connected Tyler to the outside world and step onto a surface where none of that world's rules applied. Tyler took off his shoes. He stepped onto the mat. And for the first time in 6 years, he was not the biggest person in the room in any way that mattered. He trained with Park for 6 months. He learned to fall. Not the dramatic cinematic falls he had seen in movies, but the real kind, the kind where your body meets the ground and disperses the impact through technique rather than absorbing it through mass. He fell hundreds of times, thousands. He discovered that falling was not failure. It was the foundation. You cannot learn to throw until you learn to be thrown. You cannot learn to stand until you learn to land. He lost 20 pounds in those 6 months, not from dieting, but from training differently. His body changed shape. The muscles that had been built for display began to reorganize themselves around function. His chest shrank. His grip strength quadrupled. His balance became something he could feel rather than something he assumed. He moved through the world differently, not with less presence, but with less imposition. He learned to enter a room without expecting it to rearrange itself around him. One evening, after a particularly demanding session in which Park had thrown him 17 times in succession, each throw arriving from a different angle, each one finding the gap in Tyler's awareness before Tyler knew the gap existed, Tyler sat on the mat with his GI soaked in sweat and asked the question he had been carrying since the airport. How did he do it? The man at the airport. I outweighed him by 85 pounds. I had 6 years of training. He put me down like I was a child. Park did not ask who Tyler was talking about. He sat down across from him on the mat, his old legs folding beneath him with the ease of decades of practice. Because you brought a body to a physics problem, Park said. You trained your muscles. He trained his nervous system. You taught your body to produce force. He taught his body to redirect it. Your muscles do not know what to do when the floor disappears. His body does. That is the difference between a man who lifts weight and a man who understands weight. Tyler thought about this for a long time. He thought about it the next morning while running. He thought about it that afternoon while practicing falls. He thought about it that night while lying in the small apartment he had rented 3 blocks from the dojo, staring at the ceiling, feeling his body ache in places that 6 years of gym work had never touched because those places had never been asked to do anything until now. He thought about it for 6 months, and slowly, the answer became not just something he understood intellectually, but something he felt in his bones and his tendons and the spaces between his vertebrae where balance lived. The answer was simple. Size was a fact. Skill was a choice. Facts could be overcome by choices if the choices were made with enough precision and enough repetition over enough time. The man at the airport had made his choices for 3 years. Every day, every session, every fall, and every rise. And when the 5 seconds came, the choices were ready. The facts were not. Park never asked him why he had come. Never asked about the airport. Never asked about the thin man in the leather jacket. He simply taught, and Tyler simply learned. And in the space between teaching and learning, something began to grow that Tyler had never experienced before. Competence. Not the false competence of intimidation, which required an audience and a target and produced a result that looked like respect but was actually fear. Real competence, the kind that lived in the body quietly, did not require validation, did not need to be displayed, and was available without hesitation in the moments when it mattered. 4 years later, Tyler Brandt was sitting in a movie theater in San Jose watching a film called The Matrix. He had not planned to see it. A friend from the dojo had suggested it. The lights went down, the screen lit up, and a man appeared on screen who made Tyler's blood go cold. Dark hair, lean face, brown eyes that carried something behind them that Tyler now recognized because he had seen it once before at 9:22 on a Saturday morning in an airport in San Francisco, looking down at him from above while he lay on the floor, trying to remember how breathing worked. The man on the screen was performing fight choreography that Tyler could now analyze with educated eyes. The techniques were stylized for cinema, but the foundations were real. The footwork, the weight distribution, the way the body moved as a unified chain rather than a collection of isolated parts. Tyler sat in the dark theater, watching Keanu Reeves fight on screen, and understood for the first time who had put him on the linoleum floor of San Francisco International Airport 4 years ago. The man who had taken him apart in 5 seconds, who had walked back with 2 cups of terrible coffee, who had written a dojo address on the corner of a film script, who had told him that armor does not protect but isolates, was now one of the most famous people on the planet. Tyler's hands gripped the armrests. His chest tightened. The images on the screen blurred as his eyes filled with something that he had spent 4 years at the dojo learning not to suppress. Park had taught him that emotions were like throws. You could resist them and get hurt, or you could receive them and roll through the impact and land on the other side still standing. Tyler received. He sat in that theater and let the full weight of the realization move through him. The man in the worn leather jacket. The man with the terrible airport coffee. The man who wrote a dojo address on the corner of a script. That man was now the biggest movie star in the world. He was Neo. He was the one. He was on billboards and magazine covers and the sides of buses. And 4 years ago, he had been sitting on the floor of an airport beside a broken bodybuilder, sharing bad coffee, saying things like armor does not protect you, it isolates you. Tyler thought about what Keanu could have done that day. He could have walked away. Any reasonable person who had just been called a homeless bum and had their belongings kicked across a terminal floor would have taken their boarding pass and left and felt justified in doing so. But Keanu had bought 2 cups of coffee and sat down on the floor. That was not a position at the bottom of any hierarchy that made sense. That was a position so far above anything Tyler had ever occupied that he could not see the top of it from where he sat. The credits rolled. The lights came up. People filed out. Tyler remained in his seat. An usher came by and asked if he was all right. Tyler nodded. He was more than all right. He was understanding something that had taken 4 years and a movie screen to crystallize. The man who had changed his life had not done it with a technique. The technique lasted 5 seconds. The man who had changed his life had done it with the 5 minutes after, with a cup of coffee, with a piece of paper, with the willingness to sit on a dirty floor beside someone who did not deserve it and offer them a way forward. Tyler walked out of the theater into the California night. He drove home. He opened the nightstand drawer. The torn piece of paper was still there, yellowed now, the pencil writing faded but legible. Park's address, in Keanu's handwriting. He held it for a long time. He thought about the airport, about the 5 seconds, about the coffee, about the words that had changed the direction of his life, about the fact that Keanu Reeves, a man whose face was now on billboards 40 feet high, had once sat on the floor of an airport beside him and treated him not as a villain or a victim or a project, but as a person who was in pain and deserted a door. A bodybuilding magazine published an anonymous interview with a former competitor that year. The interview was titled 5 Seconds. The competitor described learning the difference between aesthetic strength and functional strength through a public confrontation that humiliated him in front of 40 strangers. But the interview went further than most expected. I had spent 6 years building a body that looked dangerous, he said. I found out in 5 seconds that looking dangerous and being dangerous are completely different things. The man who taught me that lesson did not say a word afterward. He just picked up his boarding pass and walked away. He paused, but then he came back. He sat down on the floor beside me and gave me a cup of coffee and told me something nobody had ever told me. He said armor does not protect you. It isolates you. And if nobody can reach you, nobody can help you. Another pause. That was the part that changed everything. Not the 5 seconds on the floor. The 5 minutes on the floor after. The cup of coffee. The piece of paper with an address. The fact that someone who could have walked away chose to walk back. He was asked what happened next. What the piece of paper led to. I learned to fall, he said. I learned that falling is not failure. I learned that the body can be a tool instead of a weapon. And I learned that real strength, the kind that actually matters, is not the ability to put someone on the ground. It is the ability to sit down beside them afterward and offer them a way back up. He was asked if he ever identified the man who had taught him this. No, he said, and I never will. That is not my story to tell. What I will tell you is this. Visible strength and functional strength are related the way a photograph of a fire is related to an actual fire. One looks like the thing. One is the thing. At the airport that morning, I brought a photograph. He brought a fire, but the fire did not burn me. It warmed me, and that made all the difference. 5 seconds. That is the number that defines the first part of this story. 5 seconds from the moment Tyler extended his hand to push until he was on the floor, unable to breathe. 5 minutes. That is the number that defines the second part. 5 minutes of a man sitting on an airport floor beside the person who had just humiliated him, offering coffee and a door. The 5 seconds taught 40 witnesses something about the difference between size and skill. The 5 minutes taught one man something about the difference between power and compassion. Some lessons require a certain kind of teacher. Some teachers appear in airports on Saturday mornings, wearing leather jackets, carrying duffel bags full of scripts they have annotated with fight choreography in the margins. They wait patiently in line. They deal with whatever needs to be dealt with, quietly, completely, and then they do something that no one expects. They come back. They sit down. They offer coffee, and they write, on the torn corner of a screenplay that will never be famous, the address of a place where a broken man can learn to fall without breaking. That is the kind of strength that no gym can build. That is the kind of power that no mirror can reflect. That is the kind of fire that warms instead of burns. And 50 years from now, every time someone in a gym confuses the size of a muscle with the measure of a man, the lesson is still waiting to be learned. Real power is knowing when to stop. Real strength is knowing when to go back. And somewhere in a small dojo above a laundromat in Red Hook, Brooklyn, an old instructor named Park is still teaching. His hands are more calloused now. His back is a little more bent. His eyes still carry the calm certainty of someone who stopped being surprised by human beings 4 decades ago, but never stopped believing in them. On the wall of his dojo, there is no trophy case, no photographs of famous students, no newspaper clippings. There is only a small wooden sign, hand-carved, hung beside the door where every student sees it when they enter and when they leave. It reads, learn to fall, learn to rise, learn to stop, learn to go back. Park did not carve that sign. It arrived one morning, left outside the dojo door before dawn, wrapped in brown paper with no note. Park hung it without asking where it came from. He knew. He had always known. The thin young man in the leather jacket who had trained with him for 3 years, who showed up 4 mornings a week smelling of grief and determination, who never spoke about why he was there, who learned Osotogari on a Tuesday and mastered it by Thursday, and then spent 3 years refining it until it was as natural as breathing. The same young man whose face now appeared on movie screens around the world, performing techniques that Park recognized because he had taught them, in a body that Park had helped shape, with a discipline that Park had helped build. Park smiled every time he thought about it, not because one of his students had become famous, because one of his students had become good, and goodness, in Park's experience, was rarer than fame and more durable and infinitely more difficult to achieve. The sign stayed on the wall. Students read it every day. Some understood it immediately. Most took years. A few never understood it at all. but hung there patient and permanent, waiting for the people who needed it most. Learn to fall, learn to rise, learn to stop, learn to go back. For instructions, a lifetime of practice. And somewhere in every airport, in every check-in line, in every crowded space where large bodies move through smaller ones, expecting the world to yield, someone is waiting. Waiting to learn the lesson. Waiting for the teacher. Waiting for coffee. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you would like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next chapter we are preparing for you.